Okay, so let's dive into the different body shapes and the underlying imbalances, what they are. Today we'll talk in particular about the apple shape because that's the belly fat, that muffin top that was in the description of the workshop, and that's something that people often struggle with the most when they come and see me as well. So that apple shape, when you have skinny legs, skinny arms, oftentimes people are not overall overweight, but they just struggle with getting rid of that belly fat. They might have that layer around the waist that they can't budge. They eat less and they starve themselves, and their legs and arms are getting even skinnier, but the belly just doesn't go away. And there's usually three underlying factors, and that's blood sugar issues, inflammation, and cortisol stress hormone imbalances. That's what research shows. If those three are out of balance, then the brain sends signals to the belly to store weight around the waistline. So when I figured that out and I read that in research, I thought this was a big moment because I had so many clients that always struggled with that. And it's really, and I've tested them in the years, and it's always coming down to that blood sugar issues, inflammation, and stress. And I'll talk a little bit about where these are coming from and how we can address them in a moment. So just to remember, when we're having blood sugar issues, or we are inflamed, or we're stressed out, then we might be eating the same amount of food that we normally would, but the brain sends signals to redistribute that weight around the waist, and we're having struggle moving that waist around there, that weight around there. Okay, so where's that inflammation coming from? And first of all, also, what other issues are linked to that? Because like I said, today's talk is not just about this is your weight, do this to fix your belly fat. It's also linked to how does that all link into long-term health issues and short-term health issues. So short-term inflammation can have signs like having acne, skin issues, or period issues like PCOS, endometriosis, but also mental health issues like anxiety. It can have other skin issues, eczema, joint aches, trouble sleeping. Those are all signs in the short run that your body might be inflamed. And they're all not very nice, but often people can kind of deal with them. But then longer term, they are linked to, you saw this picture before, that all these underlying factors, one of them being inflammation, leading to all sorts of health issues. And inflammation is one of the big ones, leading to Alzheimer's, cancers, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune conditions, type 2 diabetes. Inflammation is really a big one. So we want to avoid it. And where is it coming from? So inflammation is actually a really important part of the body. It's part of our immune system. When there's a bug or an invader, like a virus or bacteria, the body produces inflammation to get rid of it. Perfectly healthy and very needed as well. But if that then lingers, then it becomes chronic inflammation, and that can cause issues. All these issues I talked about before. It basically burns us up from the inside. And then you must be thinking, okay, where's this chronic inflammation coming from? Now, first of all, is when the body didn't manage to get rid of those infections, if they linger. And a very common one is when we have the wrong type of bacteria in the gut. So people often know about the gut microbiome being very important. But if there are chronic infections in there, like parasites or also fungal infections, or there's mold in the environment, that's also a type of fungus that the body reacts to, it can cause low-grade inflammation. Another very common one are hidden food intolerances, where the body doesn't like certain healthy foods and it causes a reaction because it thinks it needs to fight it off, causing inflammation. So I see this often with my skinny patients that have that belly fat. They have chronic infections in their gut. They might not have gut issues as such, no symptoms in the gut, but when we test their stool, there's chronic infections, there's candida, and then often they're hidden food intolerances to healthy foods that they eat every day thinking they're doing themselves something good. And when we fix the gut, when we get rid of the food intolerances, then all of a sudden that layer of belly fat just goes away. Also not having the right amount of nutrients to quench inflammation, pollution, toxins around us, or too much sugar, which leads us to the next one. So sugar, if there are sugar imbalances all the time, then that can also contribute to the brain sending signals to store weight around the waistline. Now, there's this feeling of hangry that a lot of people can relate to. it's such a common symptom, is where you're getting really angry because you're hungry. Now, that is actually, as you can see here, that happens when you first had a blood sugar spike because you ate something sugary, carby, and then it drops. And that's when you get really hungry because the body thinks it's starving. Now, if this happens all the time, eventually the body becomes, every time this happens, the body causes micro damage to the cells, causing things like wrinkles and achy joints, but also causes damage to our endothelial lining, contributing to high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. But also long term, that can then lead to something called insulin resistance, where the cells don't really respond to the sugar in the blood anymore. And then that also tells the brain to send signals to the belly to store weight. So oftentimes I see that again in my skinny fat patients, the people that are skinny, but they have that layer of weight around the middle that they can't budge, is that they have that sweet tooth. They constantly have a little bit of something sweet here and there, thinking, oh, it's not so much. And calories, maybe calorie wise, might not be so much, but it constantly spikes the blood sugar and it puts them on that roller coaster, and the brain sends signals to store that around the waist, which short term, not good for our health, causes that rusting of our cells. Long term, obviously, it causes belly fat, but also can contribute to all these other things like inflammation, Alzheimer's, cancers, cardiovascular diseases. So we want to address that too. Okay, third one, big one, is stress. Now, I said number one is inflammation, number two is blood sugar imbalances, and then number three is stress. Now, people always think, oh yeah, stress is such a big word and it's blah, blah, and a little bit wacky. But there's actually so much research to back it up. Now, when we're stressed, first of all, the body doesn't really know whether there's a real tiger chasing us or whether it is stress that comes from the inside. So sometimes people think they are relaxed. But if there are some infections, inflammation, then that can also cause stress to the body. The body can't distinguish between physical stress, infections, inflammation, or pollution, toxins around us, or psychological stress. Also, it can't distinguish between real stress, such as going bankrupt or going through a divorce, or all these other really difficult times, or whether it is rumination and just overthinking stressful moments. That can also cause the same amount of stress to the body. Now, what that does, same as with inflammation and blood sugar imbalances, it tells the brain, it makes the brain tell the body to store weight around the waist, where even if the body is overall skinny, it just makes you store that weight around the waist. It also messes with our sleep. And if we don't have a good night's sleep, the next day, our body is slightly more inflamed and insulin resistant. And then these other two tie in together, as you can see. So when we're stressed, we don't sleep well as a result of it, then the next day we're more inflamed and more insulin resistant. So the body will store those calories that we're eating differently to if we had a good night's sleep and we were relaxed. Now you can see here though that we want this blue curve here is our cortisol curve. We want that. Here you can see this is 6 a.m. and then this here is 6 p.m. So we want a nice spike first thing in the morning, and then we want it to drop off throughout the day. So we don't actually want no stress at all. You can see here there's something called eustress, distress. Eustress is a good amount of stress. It's when there's a short stressor, we're exercising, there's a short work period where we're having to go full on. It's only when it stays chronically that it becomes an issue. And if it's at the wrong times of the day. Now, if we're constantly stressed, initially our cortisol will go up and then will stay elevated for the rest of the day when it should come down. That will send signals to the belly to store weight. And also it will send signals to store more calories from the same food we're eating. Then if we've been stressed for a long time, eventually that curve reverses, and in the morning we don't have enough of a spike because the body is depleted, and then we push ourselves up through coffee and other things, and then it comes up and goes too high for the rest of the day. Or worst case, it stays low. what research shows is that has similar effects if the body doesn't spike its cortisol in the morning. There's similar effects as if it was too high late in the day, where it also messes with our metabolism. It also messes with our immune system, for example. They found there's a big component between a flat cortisol in the morning and autoimmunity and cancer, because we want that cortisol first thing to prime the body, to wake everything up, and then it needs to calm down. So there's a big circadian rhythm. Here also just a few articles showing that stress can lead to dysfunctions in the gut microbiome, which can then lead to inflammation, food intolerances like we talked about before. It also can contribute to cancer cells, messing with our immune system, with our blood sugar. So stress overall, if it's the wrong curve, really can cause a lot of issues in addition to our weight. The other thing it does, it makes it much harder for us to stick to healthy habits. Now, when we're stressed, we're thinking we're being chased by a tiger, we're running away from a tiger. And so we're going into survival mode. So then rather than having our human prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain tell us rational decision making, choices such as, oh, eat your broccoli and your chicken, we then go into survival mode, which is at the back of the brain, which will tell us, no, just eat whatever you can. And ideally things that are they're really fatty, lots of calories so that you can survive. So it makes it much harder for us to make good choices. In addition to what I said before, if we're stressed, then our body is more insulin resistant and inflamed. So even if we were to eat the broccoli and the chicken, it would be much harder for the body to metabolize it properly. Talked about the fact that in the morning so this is something that I see fairly frequently in patients, that their blood cortisol should come up in the morning here, spike, and then it should come down. But instead, it stays flat in the morning when they wake up. So the immune system can't really do its job properly. The metabolism doesn't kickstart, but then they ramp it up in the day and then it stays high at night. So then their sleep is all messed up. And then it's a vicious cycle, and it makes it much harder for you to make the right choices. And also in addition to that, like I said before, it becomes much harder for the body to metabolize the foods because you're then constantly slightly inflamed and slightly insulin resistant. Okay, so what do PCOS, acne, hot flashes, vaginal dryness, cardiovascular disease all have to do with one another? I think I've made it fairly clear. I hope. I know there's lots of information that I'm putting in here today, but you'll get the recordings. You can watch it back. So they all have these same underlying factors. There's inflammation, there's blood sugar issues, and there's cortisol imbalances that all lead to these seemingly unrelated things. So people often think about hot flashes during perimenopause as being purely linked to estrogen, but actually research shows that it has a lot to do with our blood sugar and our cortisol levels. If estrogen, if it drops during the perimenopause years, our temperature gauge in the body gets a little more narrow. But then the things that actually make us flush are still blood sugar spikes and dips and cortisol, that stress spikes and dips. So in the end of the day, it's about balancing that, because hormones are much harder to balance, but we can obviously do that nowadays, which is great. Okay, so that was the first one. Then I'll just briefly touch upon the others before we go into strategies to support inflammation, to support our stress, to support our blood sugar. Okay, so we touched upon the apple shape.